All right, so let's start with the past. So climates of the past, there's a term we use called paleoclimatology. This is the science that studies past climates. And so this is before we had instruments and, you know, direct observations. And the way we have to do it is using what's called proxy indicators. These are things in nature that scientists can use to try to look backward in time to measure carbon dioxide levels and temperature, for example. Some examples include ice cores, ocean sediments, ancient pollen that's buried in bogs, tree rings. It's called dendrochronology, where we use tree ring measurements, and others. And why there's multiple ones is that different ones let you go. Some let you go further. Some are more detailed than others. Some maybe are less detailed, but you can look further back. So there are strengths and weaknesses for these different kinds of proxy indicators. So for example, tree rings are, this is called dendrochronology, where you look at the growth, you know, trees grow a ring each year. And by looking at the growth of that ring, it can tell you something about the conditions in which that tree was growing that year. So where you have conditions of drought, the tree maybe didn't grow as much, so the ring may be narrow, in good conditions for the tree, which may cause it to be wider. Another one is ice cores. And we're going to watch a video about ice cores, and that it's going to walk you through the whole process of how, you know, how they do the science. So the way it works is that ice is deposited year after year after year. And so if you dig down into the ice, there's ways that you can take measurements from the ice using either a chemical analysis or by actually extracting air bubbles from the ice itself to look at things like carbon dioxide going back in time through the ice, or the temperature going back in time. The furthest back we've gone is about through 800,000 years. So there's kind of a limit about 800,000 years. That's through like the very thick part of an Antarctic ice sheet. So another point I'll make while we're here is that there is ice in Antarctica, if you go down deep enough, that has been there for up to 800,000 years, which is quite a long time. So isotope analysis is used to measure temperatures. Trapped air bubbles are used to measure carbon dioxide. This is illustrated in much more detail and graphically in the video that I'm going to include. Now the isotope analysis, one way, that's kind of a chemical thing. So there's different kinds of isotopes for oxygen and other elements where the ratio of these isotopes depends on the amount of ice on the land. And these isotope analysis can also be used to look at the conditions on Earth when ocean sediments develop. So basically, the key point here is that I don't expect you to know the full chemistry of it, but what I want you to know is oxygen isotope analysis is used for ocean sediments and also for ice cores. So for example, this chart we saw earlier showing the Pleistocene and the Holocene, that's using isotope analysis to understand the changes in temperature going back over time. So this is from an ice core. Another one is palynology, or pollen analysis. So if you have a bog or a still lake, over time, you have sediment layers that build up at the bottom. And these sediments can include pollen from plants. So if you kind of dig down into the mud and you do your work right, you can measure the amount of pollen going back in time through different layers of the sediment. So you can use a microscope to try to identify different kinds of plants. And it doesn't directly tell you the climate conditions, but it tells you indirectly because certain plants grow better under certain conditions than others. So if you have desert plants, it tells you it's hot and dry. If you have cold weather trees, it tells you it's cold and relatively wet. Let me give you just one example to illustrate. This is the Tulare Lake. This is a lake bed. This is kind of a figure kind of showing back, you know, right around the time of the Holocene, you know, like about 10,000 years ago, more or less. And we had a big lake. This is kind of south of Fresno, called Tulare Lake. In another lecture, I'm going to talk more about Tulare Lake. But a guy did a study where he looked at palynology using sediments from Tulare Lake. So this is the chart he had. There was a period where they did, you know, either the lake was dry or they didn't get any data, but they had, you know, they looked at the relative amount of pollen from different kinds of plants. So I'm going to zoom in a little to illustrate. I'm going to use a couple of examples. This is valley oak. This is associated with Mediterranean climates, which are dry summer, wet winter. Giant sequoias, which are in the cooler, wetter parts of the Sierra Nevada. And also saltbush, which are desert plants. And so these develop under different conditions, different climate systems. And if we look at giant sequoias here, ignoring the gap there, back in the ice ages, there was a lot more giant sequoias around because we had cooler temperatures and wetter conditions. So there's more, you know, they found more pollen from giant sequoia. And then as we get into the Holocene, that really drops off. So that means you can infer from that that there were more giant sequoias around the valley back in the ice ages than there are today, right? This is a valley oak, which are more of a dry summer adapted plant. Fewer during the ice ages, but much more in the modern period. And then this is a desert saltbush. This is kind of a desert plant for the drier parts of the valley. Some of them during the ice ages, but an increasing amount during the Holocene or modern warm and dry period. All right, and so just to recap, that's how we get these charts, right? So in the beginning, we talked about these long-term trends. And so, for example, going back millions of years, that's using ocean sediments. I think each one of these dots is a single sample. And then they, you know, and then they draw a line to kind of try to fit in between all of these different samples. Hundreds of thousands of years, this is using ice core data, which can go back hundreds of thousands of years. And 1,000 years, this can be done using tree rings, right? So this may be tree ring data, ice cores, ocean sediments. 3 different kinds of proxy indicators. Tree rings being fairly detailed, but not going back too far because you can't find trees over a certain age. Ice cores, which go back a little farther, but maybe a little bit rougher. And then ocean sediments, which are really rough, but they can go a lot further back in time. So they each, you know, it's different purposes. All right, so going back, okay, we have our Mauna Loa curve that we discussed going into this, right? And using proxy indicators, we can extend that to look into the past. Like using ice core data, we can go back 800,000 years and look at, that's the Mauna Loa curve, that line that's kind of going straight up. That's how much carbon dioxide levels that's higher than any time in this past 800 years. So we've got a lot of carbon dioxide. That trend really stands out when you look at it, you know, going back hundreds of thousands of years. And if we kind of zoom into 10,000 years through the Holocene, from the beginning of the Holocene, kind of increasing and then shooting up till today, it's a lot of carbon dioxide. And as we zoom in even further to about 1700 to the present, now we're starting to kind of see it in a little bit better context. We can kind of make sense of where it's flat and where it starts to change. And where it starts to change is around maybe late 1700s, early 1800s. It starts to really go up. So what's happening from around the 1800s? The Industrial Revolution. So starting with the Industrial Revolution and ramping up to our modern era with, you know, automobiles and other things, the Industrial Revolution was really powered by burning of things like coal, and we have gasoline. We're burning a lot of fuels like gasoline and everything else. So we are adding that Keeling curve. What we're seeing is a signal, and even going back even further to the Industrial Revolution, what we see is a measurement of increasing amount of carbon dioxide, because we're burning stuff. And that's how the carbon dioxide gets in the atmosphere, because we are burning fuels, and then that emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.